Have you ever felt the chilling weight of a dream that lingers even after you wake? A dream so vivid, so terrifying, that you can't help but question if it was ever just a dream at all. My name is Elias Blackwood, a historian with a penchant for exploring the forgotten corners of the world. But this time, the forgotten corner found me. What started as an ordinary night of sleep twisted into a waking nightmare that continues to haunt me. Why I'm about to tell you is not just a story, it's a warning. Before we dive deeper into this tale, I need you to hit the subscribe button and leave a like. You'll want to stay with me because the things I've uncovered are not for the faint of heart, and trust me, you won't want to face this alone. The night it all began, I was asleep, yet something felt different. There was a weight in the air, a presence I couldn't shake. I found myself standing in the shadow of an old, forgotten house, a mansion, hidden deep within the fog. I had never seen this place before, but somehow it felt familiar, like a half-remembered whisper from a past life. The wooden beams groaned above me, as if the house was alive, watching, waiting for me to take the first step inside. With every beat of my heart, the dread grew stronger. But curiosity, no, something darker, drew me forward. It's as if the house itself was calling me, daring me to enter. This is where the real nightmare began. This place wasn't just a figment of my mind. It felt alive, sentient, and it wanted me there. But before we dive into what happened inside those walls, I need you to be prepared. Because what I found, what I experienced, changed me forever. It began like any other dream, subtle, hazy, almost innocent. But soon, it spiraled into something much darker. I found myself standing before a massive, decaying mansion, shrouded in mist so thick it seemed to crawl into my lungs with every breath. The house loomed above me, its windows like dead eyes staring out into the void. I could feel the weight of it pressing down on me, an unspoken warning that I should turn back. But my feet moved on their own, drawn forward as if the house was pulling me closer, luring me into its grasp. As I stepped inside, the smell hit me first, a thick, cloying stench of rot and mildew, like something long forgotten, festering in the dark. The air was heavy, oppressive, and the walls seemed to close in around me. But it was the sound that truly unsettled me. At first, it was faint, barely audible, like the distant hum of whispers carried on the wind. Then, as I ventured deeper, the whispers grew louder, echoing from every direction, bouncing off the walls in a disorienting, eerie symphony. I tried to pinpoint the source, but it was impossible. It was as if the house itself was speaking, its voice reverberating through the very bones of the building. The floor creaked beneath my feet, the wood soft and wet, as though it had absorbed the horrors of the past. Each step sent a shiver up my spine, but I couldn't stop. I had to know what waited in the shadows. The further I went, the more familiar everything felt, like a memory I couldn't place, a forgotten dream resurfacing. My heart pounded in my chest as I noticed something strange. The shadows didn't behave as they should. They seemed to pulse and writhe, shifting in the corner of my eye, as if something was hiding just out of sight, watching, waiting. And the whispers, they were growing clearer now, forming words that I couldn't quite understand, but that filled me with an overwhelming sense of dread. Suddenly, a door creaked open at the end of the hall, the sound cutting through the silence like a knife. A faint, flickering light spilled out from the crack, casting long, distorted shadows that danced along the walls. My skin prickled with unease, but something, curiosity, or maybe something darker, compelled me to move forward. The smell intensified as I approached, the sickly sweet stench of decay growing stronger with every step. My hand trembled as I reached for the door, pushing it open slowly, the hinges groaning in protest. I saw inside. I wasn't ready for it. The moment I stepped into that room, the air shifted, thickening like a blanket of dread wrapping itself around me. The dim light came from a single, flickering bulb hanging precariously from the ceiling, casting erratic shadows across the walls. But what disturbed me most was the silence. After the relentless whispers in the hallway, the sudden absence of sound felt wrong, as if the house was holding its breath, waiting for something. My pulse quickened, my instincts screaming at me to leave, but I couldn't move. I was frozen in place, paralyzed by the growing sense that I wasn't alone in that room. Then I noticed it, the furniture. At first glance, it seemed ordinary. An old chair by a dusty window, a table with scattered papers. But something was off. The items seemed slightly wrong, as if they had been arranged by someone who didn't understand how things were supposed to be. The chair faced the wall, not the window, and the papers were blank, torn in places and oddly stained. As I looked closer, I realized that the stains weren't from ink. They were dark, crusted, like dried blood. My stomach churned, and my mind raced with questions. What happened here? As I took another step forward, the floor creaked beneath me, but this time, it wasn't the wood. It was something else. A sound, faint but unmistakable, like breathing. Slow, labored breathing coming from the corner of the room, where the shadows were thickest. My throat tightened as I strained my eyes to see, but the darkness seemed to move, twisting and curling like smoke. I was sure there was something, or someone, lurking just beyond the edge of the light. Every fiber of my being screamed at me to run, but my legs felt heavy, rooted to the spot by fear. I turned my head slightly, just enough to glimpse the far side of the room. And then I saw it. A figure, hunched and barely visible, standing in the corner. Its outline was vague, shrouded in the shadows, but I could see the faint rise and fall of its chest as it breathed. My heart pounded in my ears, and a cold sweat broke out across my skin. For a moment, I thought I must be imagining it, that my mind was playing tricks on me. But then it moved. Slowly, deliberately, the figure shifted, turning its head toward me. Though its face was still hidden in the dark, I could feel its eyes on me, watching with an intensity that made my skin crawl. I tried to speak, but no sound came out. My mouth was dry, and my hands trembled as I took a shaky step backward. And that's when I noticed something even more terrifying. The door I had come through, it was gone. The room, once seemingly ordinary, had shifted around me. There was no exit, no escape. I was trapped in a place that defied logic, a space that seemed to breathe and move with a life of its own. My mind reeled, but the fear was so overwhelming that I couldn't think. The shadows on the walls began to stretch and shift, their forms twisting into grotesque shapes. And the breathing, it was getting louder, closer. Desperation took hold, and I turned, searching for any way out, any crack in the walls that would lead me back to reality. But as I scanned the room, I noticed something even stranger. The objects around me were no longer where they had been. The chair, the table, even the flickering light, all had moved, rearranged themselves in impossible ways. It was as if the house itself was alive, playing with me, toying with my mind. The dread that had been a whisper in the back of my head now roared in my ears, and I realized with sickening clarity, I was no longer just a guest in this place. I was its prisoner. In the heart of that nightmarish room, everything seemed to converge into a single, agonizing moment. The figure in the corner began to move toward me, slow and deliberate, as though savoring my terror. My body refused to obey me, rooted in place by an invisible force, my limbs heavy as if trapped in quicksand. The shadows slithered across the floor, stretching toward me like hungry fingers reaching for their prey. The air grew thick with a suffocating weight, and the walls seemed to pulse, as if the house itself had come alive, breathing in rhythm with the figure that now stood mere feet away. Then, with a sudden flicker of movement, the light bulb above me sputtered and went out. Darkness swallowed the room whole, leaving me in an abyss where I could no longer distinguish the walls from the shadows, the figure from the air. My heart raced, pounding in my chest like a drumbeat of dread. I couldn't see, but I could hear a low, rasping breath that wasn't my own, echoing louder and louder, circling me. Whatever was in the room with me was now closer, so close that I could feel its cold, clammy presence brushing against my skin. My pulse throbbed in my throat as panic clawed at me, but my body remained paralyzed by terror. Suddenly, the light flickered back on, weak and dim, but enough to reveal the figure standing directly in front of me. It wasn't human, at least, not anymore. Its eyes, or rather, the hollow, empty pits where eyes should have been, bored into me, blacker than the void that had swallowed the room moments earlier. Its face was twisted, grotesque, a pale mask of decay, skin stretched tight over its bones as if it had been trapped in the house for centuries, feeding off the fear of anyone unlucky enough to enter. My breath caught in my throat as it reached out a skeletal hand, its fingers long and gnarled, each nail sharp like a blade. I tried to scream, but no sound escaped my mouth. My voice, my ability to speak, had vanished, leaving me mute in the presence of this abomination. The figure's hand hovered just inches from my face, the cold radiating off it like a draft from an open grave. And then, in one swift motion, it lunged forward, its fingers closing around my throat. My vision blurred, and the world around me seemed to tilt and spin as the room collapsed in on itself. The walls stretched, the floor buckled beneath my feet, and the ceiling seemed to grow taller, as if the house was swallowing me whole. In a desperate act, I squeezed my eyes shut, willing myself to wake up, to escape this nightmare. My pulse thundered in my ears, and for a moment, everything went silent. Then, with a jolt, I gasped for air and snapped my eyes open, only to find myself back in my bedroom. I was drenched in cold sweat, my heart racing so fast it felt like it would explode out of my chest. For a brief, glorious moment, I believed it was over, just a horrific dream, nothing more. But then, something caught my eye. The clock on my nightstand glowed an eerie red, 3:33 a.m., the exact time I had woken up in the dream. And worse still, there was a sound. At first, it was faint, barely perceptible over the sound of my labored breathing. But then it grew, filling the room with an all-too-familiar echo, the same rasping breath I had heard in the dream. My body froze as I realized it was coming from the corner of my bedroom, the same corner where the figure had stood in the dream. Slowly, I turned my head, dread twisting in my stomach, and there, in the shadows, I saw it, a shape, faint but unmistakable, standing still, watching. The nightmare hadn't ended when I woke. It had followed me, crossing the boundary between dream and reality. I wanted to believe that it was my imagination, that I was still caught in the remnants of a terrible dream. But deep down, I knew the truth. Whatever haunted me in that mansion had found me in the real world, and there was no waking up from this. My room felt colder, the air heavy with something unnatural. I closed my eyes again, hoping that when I opened them, everything would be normal. But when I did, the figure was still there, closer now. It had stepped out of the dream and into my life, and I knew it wasn't going to leave. This wasn't just a dream anymore. This was a nightmare that had become real. The days following that nightmare were consumed by an unsettling paranoia. I couldn't shake the feeling that something from the dream had followed me, lurking just out of sight, waiting for the right moment to make itself known. Every creak of my apartment, every shadow flickering in the corner of my vision, sent chills down my spine. But what terrified me most was that same breath, the low, rasping sound that echoed through my room at night. It was faint, always just on the edge of hearing, but unmistakable. I tried to tell myself it was in my head, a leftover echo from the dream, but deep down, I knew that wasn't the truth. Desperate for answers, I began researching. I couldn't ignore the parallels between my dream and the mansion I had seen. Something about that place felt disturbingly real, as if I had been there before. I started digging through old records, searching for anything that matched the house from my dream, a crumbling mansion, isolated, forgotten. After hours of searching, I stumbled upon an old newspaper article. The headline read, "The House of Echoes, Mystery of the Vanished Souls." My blood ran cold as I scanned the page. There it was, the same house, standing eerily still in a grainy black and white photo. The article detailed the disappearance of several people over the last century, all of whom had been last seen near the mansion. Locals had long whispered that the house was cursed, a place where reality and nightmares blended into one. They called it the House of Echoes because of the strange phenomena that occurred there: voices, footsteps, and that same haunting breath, as if the house itself was alive and calling out to its victims. The more I read, the more convinced I became that this wasn't just a coincidence. My dream had taken me to that very place. But how? Why? And worse, what did it want from me? The name in the article, the House of Echoes, seemed to pulse in my mind, a reminder of the whispers I'd heard in the dream. It was as if the house had found a way to reach me through my subconscious, pulling me into its twisted reality. But the most disturbing part was yet to come. As I scrolled through the rest of the article, a familiar symbol caught my eye. It was a crude, circular shape with jagged lines cutting through it, almost like a broken sun. My breath hitched in my throat. It was the exact same symbol I had seen on the walls of the mansion in my dream, the one that had appeared again and again, burned into my memory. Suddenly, it all made sense. The dream wasn't just some figment of my imagination. The house was real, and it had been calling out to me, marking me as its next victim. Panic set in as I realized that I wasn't the first to experience this. The people who had vanished, they had probably dreamed of the house, too. And now, it was my turn. I couldn't escape the feeling that I was next, that the house wouldn't stop until it had consumed me just as it had consumed them. I felt the weight of the house's presence everywhere I went, even in the waking world. Desperation clawed at me, and I knew I had to speak to someone who might know more. I tracked down a local historian who had written about the area's dark past, including the mysterious mansion. When I met him, his face grew pale the moment I mentioned the House of Echoes. He looked at me with a mixture of fear and pity, as if he knew something I didn't, or something I wasn't ready to hear. He spoke in hushed tones, telling me that those who had visited the house reported the same things: dreams, whispers, the sound of breathing that followed them, and in some cases, madness. The house didn't just exist in the physical world, he said. It reached out into the minds of those it chose, trapping them in a nightmare from which they could never escape. His words hit me like a punch to the gut. I had been marked. The house had chosen me, and there was no running from it. Every night, I feared falling asleep, terrified that I would wake up in the mansion again, standing in that same decaying room with the figure watching from the shadows. But more than that, I feared the growing certainty that I hadn't left the house at all. It had brought itself into my life, weaving itself into the fabric of my reality, until there was no distinction between dream and waking. The symbol from the article, the whispers in the night, the breath that followed me, they were all signs that the nightmare wasn't over. It had only just begun. Driven by an overwhelming need for answers, I knew what I had to do. I had to go to the House of Echoes. As insane as it sounded, I couldn't shake the feeling that the only way to escape this nightmare was to confront it. The fear was suffocating, but I had no choice. If the house had already breached the boundary between dream and reality, it wasn't going to stop. Not until it claimed me, like it had claimed so many others. So, I packed a bag with the essentials, flashlight, camera, and my journal, and made the drive out to the location I had found in the old articles. The road twisted through dense, foreboding woods, and as I neared the mansion, an unnatural fog began to envelop my car, just like in the dream. When I arrived, the house stood before me exactly as I remembered it from my nightmare. It was worse than I had imagined. The air was thick with a sense of foreboding, as if the house was aware of my presence, waiting for me. The once grand structure now sagged under the weight of time, its walls cracked and blackened by age. The windows, those same dead, empty eyes, seemed to follow me as I approached. The front door, slightly ajar, groaned as it swung open, beckoning me to enter. My heart pounded in my chest as I stepped inside, the weight of dread pressing down on me with each step. The moment I crossed the threshold, the temperature dropped. The air inside the house was stifling, thick with the scent of damp rot and something else, something metallic, like blood. My footsteps echoed unnaturally, bouncing off the decaying walls. But there was something more. I wasn't alone. The whispers had returned, faint at first, but growing louder as I moved deeper into the house. They weren't just random murmurs anymore. They formed fragmented sentences, broken pleas for help, and something more sinister. Laughter, low and guttural, as if mocking me. The air buzzed with tension, and my skin prickled as if the house itself was alive, watching my every move. As I moved through the hallways, the house seemed to shift around me, just like in the dream. Rooms I had just passed reappeared, hallways twisted in impossible ways, and doors led to nowhere. The floor beneath me groaned and creaked as if protesting my presence. Each room I entered felt like it had absorbed years of pain and suffering, as if the walls themselves were steeped in agony. And then I saw it. The symbol, that same jagged circle from my dream, carved deep into the wood of a door at the end of a long corridor. My breath caught in my throat as I approached it. The symbol seemed to pulse with a dark energy, drawing me closer, even though every instinct screamed at me to run. With trembling hands, I pushed the door open, revealing a small, dust-covered room. In the center stood a lone figure. At first, I thought it was a mannequin, but as I stepped closer, I realized it was a man, pale, gaunt, and still as stone. His eyes were wide open, unblinking, fixed on the wall. His skin was stretched tight over his bones, and his lips were cracked and dry, as if he hadn't spoken in years. And then, without warning, he turned his head slowly, painfully, to look at me. "You shouldn't be here," he whispered, his voice barely audible, as if the air itself was suffocating him. Before I could respond, the room grew colder, the light flickered, and I felt it, a presence. Something ancient, something malevolent was watching us. The man's eyes widened in terror, and his body began to tremble. He reached out a bony hand, grabbing my wrist with surprising strength. "It's coming for you. It's been waiting." His voice cracked, and his grip tightened, his nails digging into my skin. Panic surged through me, and I yanked my hand free, stumbling backward. The whispers in the walls grew louder, swirling around me in a cacophony of voices, some pleading, some laughing, but all filled with an unbearable sense of doom. And then I saw it. In the shadows, something moved, something not human. A figure, tall and twisted, its limbs too long, its eyes glowing faintly in the darkness. It was the same figure from my dream, but now it was real, and it was coming for me. My heart pounded as I backed away, but there was nowhere to run. The house had shifted again, closing off every exit, trapping me within its nightmarish walls. The figure stepped closer, its presence overwhelming, filling the room with a suffocating sense of despair. I could feel its eyes on me, piercing through the darkness, seeing into my very soul. I had the sickening realization that this was the source of the house's power, the thing that had been haunting my dreams, and now it had me cornered. My mind raced, searching for a way out, but the walls felt as though they were closing in, bending and warping around me. The man in the room screamed, a sound filled with pure terror, but it was cut short, and I was alone again with the thing that stalked me. As the darkness closed in, I realized the horrifying truth. This wasn't just about me. The house had been waiting for years, trapping others in the same nightmare, and now it had me. The man's words echoed my mind. "It's coming for you. It's been waiting." And I knew, with a chilling certainty, that there was no escape. The house had chosen me, and whatever it wanted, it would not stop until it had taken everything from me. The whispers grew louder, the figure stepped closer, and the last sliver of light faded away. In the heart of the House of Echoes, the air grew so heavy I could barely breathe. My pulse raced, and my legs felt like they were wading through thick, invisible sludge. Every instinct screamed at me to run, but there was no escaping the malevolent presence that had me cornered. The figure, now fully emerged from the shadows, towered before me. Its form was grotesque, an abomination of long, twisted limbs and a face that was both featureless and filled with a soul-crushing darkness. The eyes, two voids of nothingness, locked onto mine, and I felt my mind unraveling, as if it were peeling away the very essence of who I was. The walls of the house began to pulsate, as though the structure itself was alive, feeding off the terror coursing through me. Suddenly, a low, guttural sound rumbled through the room, an inhuman growl that made my blood run cold. The house trembled, its foundations groaning under the weight of the thing inside it. I stumbled backward, my hand brushing against something cold and hard on a nearby shelf. It was a small, ancient artifact, an intricately carved stone tablet. My fingers traced the symbols etched into it, and recognition hit me like a punch to the gut. It was the same symbol I had seen in my dream, the same one scrawled on the door, the broken circle with jagged lines. The realization struck me with terrifying clarity. This artifact was somehow connected to the house, to the horrors that lurked within it. As I clutched the tablet, a surge of energy coursed through me, not comforting, but more like a current of fear. The whispers that had followed me through the mansion grew louder, becoming a cacophony of voices, all repeating the same word: choose. The figure advanced, its twisted form distorting the air around it, warping reality itself. It stopped just inches from me, its empty eyes burning into my soul. Then, with a voice that sounded like 100 voices speaking in unison, it whispered, "The choice is yours." I was paralyzed with fear, unable to move, unable to think. What choice? The house had already taken control. What was left to decide? And then I understood. This wasn't just about me. It was about everyone who had come before, everyone the house had claimed. The artifact in my hand began to pulse, growing warmer, its symbols glowing faintly in the dim light. The broken circle, the jagged lines, they were part of a ritual, a binding that had trapped souls within the house for generations. The house wasn't just haunted, it was a prison, and I was holding the key. But unlocking it came with a cost. The whispers continued, louder now, urging me to decide. I knew what was at stake. If I broke the cycle, if I used the artifact to destroy the house's grip, I could free the trapped souls, those who had been lost to the mansion's darkness. But there was a catch. To do so meant offering something in return, my own soul. The house demanded sacrifice, and if I chose to release the others, I would take their place. I could feel the weight of the decision crushing me. There was no easy way out, no loophole or escape. Either I saved myself and left the others to their fate, or I became a part of the house, forever bound to its walls, its whispers, its endless night. The figure stood motionless, waiting. Its hollow eyes reflected my fear, as though savoring the moment of my indecision. My hands trembled as I clutched the tablet tighter. Could I really condemn the others? People like the man I had seen. People who had once had lives, hopes, and dreams, now lost, wandering the corridors of this nightmare forever. But if I sacrificed myself, there was no telling what would happen next. Would I become one of the whispers? Just another lost voice in the dark? Or worse, would I take the form of the very figure that now loomed over me, doomed to lure others into the same fate? I felt the pressure closing in, the weight of the house pressing down on my chest. The choice was suffocating. My mind raced with images of the people who had disappeared, their faces blurred by time, but their fear still palpable. I could hear their whispers more clearly now, no longer disjointed murmurs, but desperate pleas for release. I couldn't bear it. I couldn't be the reason they remained trapped. With a deep breath, I raised the artifact in my trembling hand. The figure watched, its body twitching slightly, as though it knew what I was about to do. My heart hammered in my chest as I prepared to utter the words that would seal my fate. The moment I spoke the first syllable, the house reacted violently. The floorboards beneath my feet buckled, the walls quivered, and the air around me grew thick with an unnatural force. The artifact burned hot in my hand, the glowing symbols intensifying as the ritual took hold. The whispers turned to screams, agonized, desperate cries that filled the room, shaking the very foundation of the mansion. The figure recoiled, its twisted form writhing, as though it was being torn apart from the inside. And then, in one final, deafening roar, Everything went silent. I collapsed to the ground, the artifact falling from my hand, its glow extinguished. The house was still, eerily so. The oppressive presence that had suffocated me since I entered was gone, but I felt no relief. I knew what I had done. I had freed them, the souls trapped in the house, but I had sealed my own fate in the process. My body felt heavy, my limbs cold, as if the house was slowly drawing me into itself. The walls no longer moved, but I could feel the weight of them pressing down on me. The figure was gone, but its essence remained, lingering in the air like a ghostly imprint. And then I realized I had become part of the house. When I woke up, everything felt wrong. The light in the room was dim, as if filtered through thick fog, and there was a sharp smell of disinfectant in the air. It took me a moment to realize where I was, a hospital. I lay there, my body numb, my thoughts slow and scattered. How did I get here? The last thing I remembered was the house, the ritual, the screaming, the figure, everything a blur of terror and chaos. My chest tightened as the memory of the final moments crashed over me. The feeling of the house pulling me in, absorbing me into its cursed walls, had been so vivid, so real. But now I was here, alive. Or was I? I tried to sit up, but pain shot through my body, anchoring me to the bed. A nurse entered the room, her expression unreadable. "You were found unconscious near an old mansion," she said softly. "There was no sign of injury, but you've been unresponsive for days." Her words barely registered. Asterisk unconscious. Days. Asterisk the timeline didn't make sense. It was as if time had bent, as if events inside the house had stretched far longer than the real world allowed. My mouth was dry. My voice cracked as I tried to speak. "The house, is it still there?" I whispered. Her eyes flickered with something, fear, recognition. She hesitated before answering. "The place you were found, it's been abandoned for decades. People say it's haunted, but there's nothing there anymore. It's just ruins now." My blood ran cold. Just ruins? No, that couldn't be right. I had seen it, touched it, been inside it. But the look in her eyes told me everything. To the outside world, the house was a forgotten relic. But to those it chose, it was very much alive. And it wasn't finished with me. As the days passed, I couldn't shake the lingering sense of dread. Even after being discharged from a hospital, I felt something was watching me, always just out of sight. At night, I heard it again, the low, rasping breath from the house. It was faint at first, barely audible over the hum of the city, but it grew louder with each passing day. My dreams were plagued by the same shadowy figure, its hollow eyes staring into me as if it were biding its time. I would wake up drenched in sweat, the whispers still echoing in my ears. And then, the symbol, the broken circle with jagged lines, began appearing everywhere. Scribbled on the pages of my journal, etched into the condensation on my bathroom mirror, even drawn into the dirt on my car's windshield. The house hadn't let go. I was still part of its twisted game. One night, unable to sleep, I decided to confront the truth. I had to know if the house still stood, or if it had been reduced to rubble, as the nurse claimed. I drove out to the location, my hands trembling on the wheel. The road was the same, winding through dense trees, and as I neared the spot, the same thick fog from my dreams began to creep across the ground. My heart raced as I reached the clearing. There, where the mansion had once loomed in my nightmares, was nothing but ruins, crumbling stone walls, overgrown with weeds and vines. But even as I stood there, staring at the remains, I felt it. The weight of the house, watching, waiting. I turned to leave, but something caught my eye. Among the rubble, half buried in the dirt, was the artifact, the tablet from the house. The same jagged symbol etched into its surface. My breath caught in my throat. How had it ended up here? I hesitated, then reached down to pick up. The moment my fingers touched the cold stone, a shiver ran through me. The whispers returned, faint but unmistakable, carried on the wind. The house wasn't gone. It had simply changed, shifted into something I couldn't see. but I could still feel it, lurking just beneath the surface, waiting for the right moment to pull me back in. From that moment on, I knew there was no escaping the house. It had claimed me, just as it had claimed all the others before me. And now, it was only a matter of time before it called me back. The whispers grew louder with each passing night, and the symbol appeared more frequently. It was everywhere I looked, a constant reminder that the nightmare wasn't over. It never would be. I could feel the house's influence growing stronger, seeping into my thoughts, my dreams, my very existence. Now, as I sit here, writing this, I can hear the breathing again. It's closer tonight, louder, almost as if it's right behind me. The house is waiting, and I know that soon I'll have to return. There's no running from it. No escape. The question isn't if, but when. So, to those of you watching this, I need to ask, what would you do? Would you risk your life to break free from the nightmare, knowing that you might only make things worse? Or would you surrender, accepting the house's pull, and become part of its twisted legacy forever? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. And if you've ever experienced something like this, something you can't explain, share your story. Maybe together, we can figure out what's real and what's a nightmare. But remember this, some doors, once opened, can never be closed again. Before you go, make sure to subscribe to the channel and leave a like. Trust me, you'll want to stay connected, because sometimes nightmares don't end when we wake.